and welcome to another episode of Tea Time with Eddie. Today is March 18th, 2017, and although the ground is snow-covered, it is actually quite pleasant outside today. Perhaps the snow was holding it a little bit of, perhaps a little bit of heat or blanketing the land somewhat, and that sort of idea of the blanketing of the land is extending towards a feeling of personal warmth, which could be a contributing cause, at least on a mental level, which does play a big part, actually, considering all things are sort of like filtered through the brain. Yeah, so on this day, after St. Patrick's Day, in which I hope you had a very meritorious time, I know I certainly did, I would like to talk about two particular things. Briefly, of course, the yoga of loving sidelong glances and the space-time continuum in general. So, what do I mean by the yoga of loving sidelong glances? In this particular context, what I am going to be referring to is essentially that little bit of a world that you notice in the corner of your eye. I guess you could say this, you could almost see that as sort of like something metaphorical, in that it is perhaps like certain realms or elements of consciousness that aren't like directly in front of you, directly perceptible, directly palpable. But I think I will instead maybe talk just a little bit more about the idea of noticing things in the corner of your eye that you don't necessarily have the ability to immediately quantify, the ability to immediately define. So, for example, you are going anywhere, doing anything, and you notice something in the corner of your eye. You know, as far as you are able to see the corner of your eye. Yeah, right about here. I can see right about here. Anyways, let's see, check this side. Yeah, I can see right about here as well, too. That's interesting. Now, what I would like to mention when this happens, oftentimes when something appears in the corner of your eye that you cannot immediately define or label with, like, the convenience of, let's say I look there, oh, that's a tree. I'm able to immediately define. I'm able to immediately label that particular object as a tree. Yet, at the same time, which is interesting, what part of a tree is actually the tree? You can't really find a singular part. And this kind of dissective nature of analysis can be given to anything that you place a label upon. So, when you notice something in the corner of your eye, and if it's in a particular situation in which you are perhaps somewhat idle, somewhat in the capability of feeling curious, or perhaps, just like in any situation, you oftentimes, if you're not able to define it immediately, will turn to look in that direction, to look upon that object so you can label it and then forget about it. And what the yoga of the loving sidelong glances is to notice things in the corner of the eye and not immediately give into the impulse of looking at it and defining it. Rather, to just allow it to transpire in that unknown element, not knowing what it is, and just being okay with that to a reasonable extent. Obviously, if there's some kind of like true danger, that's a little bit different, a danger to your body, or your body or mind or something of that nature. But the instances of that are actually very minute. And also as well, there would be corresponding factors that would encourage you to have a further reaction as well. Anyways, though, what I'm getting at is allowing these things that you notice within your corner of the eye to transpire without immediately feeling that you have to define them, that you have to place them in a category. Because what you're essentially doing is making them into something that they're inherently not truly are. And that whole entire process of creating that formation within the mind, you do so out of like a reflexive tendency to bring yourself into a reflexive tendency that you have been developing a habit of over for a very long time. And this habit gives a certain sense of comfort when you continually habituate it, you continually repeat it, because that's why people have habits, is to put themselves in a state of comfort and ease, and somewhat of a nullifying state of mind, somewhat of a more dulled state of mind, which, because they don't necessarily have to, because they don't have to really truly investigate or analyze as much if you place things into a category and then file them neatly away within your perception. So, the yoga of loving sidelong glances is to allow things to transpire within the corner of your eye, and then letting them sort of appear and disappear without placing labels upon them. And I feel like this can be very skillfully done in this modern society where there are so many people everywhere. So many people, and make no mistake. I mean, obviously for this lifetime, which is quite apparent, given if you are actually hearing these words and seeing my body. It's quite apparent that in this lifetime, you're going to come across more population than isolation, more instances of crowds of people rather than instances of complete and total solitude away from that particular like feeling of being watched by many of your human brothers and sisters. And it's important to appreciate the fact that this is a very, very real reality. I mean, I'm in the woods. I don't see another person right now, but I can hear the freeway, and I'm sure that the audio is picking up the freeway as well in the distance. And so every single second, less than a mile away, there's 10 people passing me by. That's not an unrealistic number, And so, with that being said, allowing the presence of others to transpire within the corner of your eye produces a sensation of the loving sidelong glances, because you are allowing it to happen and you aren't placing a definition upon what is occurring that is slightly mostly imperceptible within the moment. And when you don't have that chain of conceptualization, which is essentially likened, which is a sign that you are into a chain of conceptualization if you feel compelled to place, like labels upon things. And for instance, if you were to be in a large crowd of people, if you were to just place a label of indifference on those that you notice within the corner of the eye, that is a sign of the chain of conceptualization, because that indifference is a sign that you are basically actively attempting to separate yourself from others. That's what indifference really is. It is a separation from others, in stating that they don't have any kind of particular connection to me, so I don't have to feel anything for them. And so if you are able to let go of that indifference and instead just really allow the formations to come and go, and not to cling on to them, not to push them away, which is the attachment or aversion, the other another two extremes, then what occurs is a slight sense of bliss that you feel. And it may actually feel like there is a bit of a loving connection to those beings that you are noticing in the corner of your eye. You may feel like there is somewhat of a rapport. And it's not a rapport in that all of a sudden you can
suddenly engage with them as if you've known them, intimately or personally for a very long period of time. That particular context is, mostly unrealistic. There are examples, I suppose, if people have certain connections that don't necessarily aren't necessarily explainable based on the events of their lifetime. There are there are examples of people who have connections in that way. But you don't have, if that does occur, it's you won't have to try to have that occur. So it's not really worth mentioning so much within the moment. What is instead more skillful to mention is just the idea that if you allow events to unfold in the corner of your eye, and this is speaking physically and metaphorically, if you can do this and not say that they're good, that they're bad, or that they have no effect or bearing upon you, and then actively place them within these particular labels and use it as a source of comfort, it may produce a certain sense of unease at first, and yeah, most certainly it does at times. But what's occurring is that's just the unease that comes from the withdrawal you feel from an act that gives you comfort. It is from the act of sort of drugging yourself through labeling. And this particular kind of form of drugging oneself is certainly not something that is as actively attempted to abolish as opposed to the habits of smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol or taking, prescription painkillers. But it is just as valid, and you should, most certainly break those kinds of habits, I suppose. Breaking those kinds of habits can definitely have benefit in breaking these more subtle habits as well. So, yes, that's a little bit of the yoga of loving sidelong glances. And now I would like to talk a little bit about the space-time continuum. Oh, goodness. I suppose, time's, there's plenty of time, of course. I'll briefly state this. So, space-time continuum, what I'm basically just going to state is that, okay, you are in this world, you are right now, and everything that you see, everything that you do, and everything you interact with your perception, which includes your 5 sense consciousnesses, and also, your mental consciousness as well, it is based basically on a mutual perception with the world around you, with others around you that are within this world. But if you really think about it, this is based off of seeing time in a certain way. It is in seeing time as progressing from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, week to week, year to year. It comes from this sort of very strong mutual karmic perception. However, if you think about it though, what if a minute to one person was 1,000 years to another being? That would imply that within 1 minute, whole entire generations of beings could live and die and all of that. And now, how can that be proven? Well, what you can state is if that was the case, if that level of speed of perception of time was prevalent with other beings, there's really no way that you would be able to perceive that because of the rapidity, the rapidity of the motions. You can't physically see a light beam, but it is traveling, 180,000 miles per second, between 120 and 180,000 miles, I believe. And it's at the same time, it's a result of everything that you perceive that you see with your eye consciousness and physical form, is a result of light beams bouncing off of objects. And it's really interesting that speed of motion is perceived as something that is solid or stagnant. And so basically what I'm stating is that you are in this world,
and you are sharing this world with numerous beings who are perceiving time in a similar way. But I think it's important to sort of appreciate the idea that in any particular way, in any particular viewpoint that you have, you are also sharing with in many ways that you cannot perceive with your sense consciousnesses. And just because you cannot necessarily perceive at the very moment these other worlds that are existing within different perceptions of time doesn't mean they do not exist. And what I feel is it's just important to kind of have a certain sense of openness in this regard, and to also understand the freedom that you have to experience this openness, and also as well to find when you are acting or interacting within this world. I think it is important to feel like what you are doing is you're not necessarily acting in a way that you feel like you should act because it gives comfort to those beings you have mutual perception with. And at the same time, you feel like you're just rehearsing what gives them comfort. Rather, it is important to act in a way that expresses the capacity to extend one's perception beyond just appearance. And that actual motivation is something that is much more beneficial to those beings you have mutual perception with, even if it feels like you're not doing anything at the time you are strengthening this motivation. So, to break free of the space-time continuum requires the strengthening of your motivation in ways that people cannot see. But that does not mean that there is not a true benefit to it. So, and the yoga of loving sidelong glances does contribute to this, because once again, you are not labeling, you are not trying to categorize as a means of bringing comfort to your mind, and as a means to try and bring comfort to others by giving them something that is familiar within the context of their labeling. And with this certain sense of freedom, as you are strengthening it, you will feel periods of unease. I feel periods of unease, somewhat frequently, but whenever analyzed, you can truly find as well that this is the breaking of habits, the unease that is the breaking of habits. And when push comes to shove, all of a sudden there is great strength, because you are developing the motivation. You are developing the iron fist of skillful means. So, with that being said, I really do appreciate this episode indeed, and I wish you all a very wonderful day on the